G'day and welcome to another episode of Spectrum Uncensored. Today I have with me Sarah from Albury in New South Wales. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your profession.
So I am a speech pathologist. I work as a speech pathologist in a few different ways. So I am a university lecturer and researcher. So research is probably my biggest part of my job and my greatest passion and love. So I love researching all about children's communication development. And so I do that. I teach the next generation of speech pathologists through the lecturing side of things. And then I also have a private practice where I work individually with kids in speech therapy. And I have a special focus on working with neurodiverse kids.
That's a lot. Like you got a lot going on. Like, hats off to you. I don't think I can manage
ADHD, you know.
We wear a lot of hats, don't we? But my son is he's neurodivergent, but he's also nonverbal. So that definitely speech pathology and things like that is pretty close to my heart because we've had to go through a lot of speech therapy and things like that and try to work out what communication works best for him. He's got an AAC as well as he falls back on PECs if we're having issues with his AAC, but he smashed it the other day, so we kind of had to go back to the basics for a little bit. He does a little bit of sign language as well, but yeah, it's definitely been a journey, and obviously you would know that with all of your expertise. And what got you into that?
I've thought about this a fair bit because when I finished school, I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I had okay grades and I liked to talk. I was good at English. So really the careers advisor just had those books, where you could choose what you wanted to do at university. And he said, I think you should try speech pathology. So I was like, okay, I'll try that. I didn't really know what it was, to be honest. I had a little cousin who had some speech therapy when he was younger, but the actual scope of the profession and knowing all the different things that a speech pathologist does, I kind of had no idea. I just went into it blind. But once I was in there, I was like, oh, this is definitely the right job for me. Basically my whole life, and I guess not realizing I was neurodivergent until much later in life, I totally analysed everything that people said and the way that people communicate, and I was a really deep thinker about all of that kind of stuff, not realising that I then fell into a profession that perfectly aligns with, understanding the world and how people communicate and how we share messages and tone and, grammar and all these little things that play around in our neurodivergent minds when we play with words and things like that. And so I ended up landing exactly where I wanted to be.
It sounds like it was definitely your calling. And I know, like, when I started speech therapy with my son, I didn't realise just how in-depth it was. Like, most people, they think speech therapy and they think, oh, well, you just sit down and you try to get a kid to say something.
Yeah.
But there's so much more involved. Like, obviously, my kid doesn't talk, but he still goes to speech therapy, and people are like, well, how does that work? Because he doesn't talk. But that is not a prerequisite.
No, it's about communication more broadly.
Yeah. And you were saying you do lectures. Do you do that at the university that you graduated from, or are you at a different one?
No, I'm actually at the same one. So because I'm from a rural area, I'm really passionate about rural health. And, this university in Albury, that's where I went to uni because I, lived nearby, and it gives rural people an opportunity to get that tertiary education. And so I always wanted to kind of stay with them and keep giving back in that same way to rural communities. So yeah, I've moved away a few times and come back, and but yeah, still with that same uni working for rural health.
It is very much like you're giving back to the community and to that particular place where you studied. Which is really nice. It's keeps it going, and it's almost like an act of kindness in a way, isn't it? Like you're almost indebted a little bit, but I like that. So you were saying that you're neurodivergent, so ADHD?
Yes, yeah.
And when were you diagnosed? Late diagnosis, I think you said.
Yeah, I was only actually officially diagnosed this year, but I've probably known for maybe 2 or 3 years, but it was very late in life. I always knew that my brain worked differently to everybody else. And it's quite funny, actually, the way that I came. And I also have neurodivergent children. And I could pick that straight away because, so I first knew my son was neurodivergent at 9 months because, I work with autistic kids all the time. And it didn't worry me at all. I was just like, okay, he's stimming. Yep, I think he's neurodivergent. And, everyone initially was like, oh, that's just because you do that for a living. You think that he's doing that. But, it was. And it was never anything that I worried about. So I never got him diagnosed because it was just never really an issue. But then as he's gotten older, more and more, I guess challenges have arisen. And I also now realise that he's ADHD as well. So we're going through the diagnosis process with him. But circling back to what I was saying about rural health is it's so incredibly difficult to get appointments in rural areas, particularly for assessments around neurodiversity. So even though I've known about his neurodiversity his whole life, we have our diagnostic appointment in 2 weeks, and it's been 2 years of waiting for that appointment, to get that official diagnosis. And so, but going back to how I figured out that I was neurodivergent, I actually teach in a clinic, our students at the university, and we're working in the clinic. And the way that we kind of teach is we'll have children come in and we'll develop sessions with them. And then if something comes up, I might do a lecture on that for the students just so they can learn more about it. So if it's Down syndrome, if it's speech stuttering, whatever. And we kept having a lot of kids come in with ADHD. And so I said, oh, well, next week I'll do a lecture on ADHD for you guys just so that you can be more prepared. And when I was doing the preparation for the lecture, I was like, oh, my goodness, I have ADHD. Epiphany. So I did one of those online tests, and I remember it had like this rating scale that goes from like a semicircle from red around to green, and I scored like off the chart in the red of having ADHD. And I was like, oh, okay, right, that explains like everything that I've always known is a little bit different about my brain, but never had the words for it. And it was just, it's actually been so liberating to figure out that I am neurodivergent, because it explains so much that I probably used to beat myself up a bit about. So like being late, being forgetful, being disorganized, all that kind of thing. I just would be so frustrated. I'm like, why is life so much harder for me than it is for everybody else? And I just literally cannot figure out why this is hard, and everyone else seems to be able to show up on time and not be flustered.
Yeah, I think everyone I've spoken to that has been diagnosed late in life says very similar things. I know that for me it was exactly the same. I felt empowered once I knew, and you shame yourself and you guilt yourself until you realise, or you have that moment, that aha moment where it's like, oh, okay, that's why I do those things. And then you forgive yourself, you don't feel the shame anymore. So it actually helps you love yourself a little more readily, because you are usually like going, why am I like this? What is wrong with me? But it's not that there's something wrong with you. It's just that your brain is wired differently and you do things differently.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think the next step on that journey that I've seen a lot of people take is you kind of figure out that you have ADHD, you get medication for that, and then you start to realize that maybe you're also autistic. But you didn't realize that either. So that's kind of where I am on my journey at the moment. It's like, oh, some of these traits are also not quite explained by the ADHD. So I'm still like in that kind of discovering my own brain space and just being open to that, and realizing that, it's not anything to worry about or anything to be ashamed about, but it is very helpful to understand how your own brain works so that you can figure out how your life can function a little bit more easily.
I was more fortunate that when I sat down, pretty much straight off the bat, the psychologist was like, autistic and ADHD. It wasn't just like straight away, because I got diagnosed through wanting to know whether I was different or if it was trauma related stuff. So it was both, but it it definitely opened my eyes up to even like the comorbid relationship, because my son is autistic and ADHD too. So I started to realize the dynamic between the two diagnoses and how they can work well together, but then they can also really not work well together. And for me, I struggle with that push-pull from the comorbid. And I would say that I'm more ADHD than I am ASD. But I found it interesting because the psychologist actually diagnosed me as a level 2 because I have ADHD. She actually said to me, if you didn't have ADHD, I would say you were level 1,
Right.
which used to be Asperger's. But because I had the ADHD, because it can work against the ASD, it almost makes you more autistic. But that's because of the overlap. As you say, there's a lot of things that overlap, but then there's those little things that you're like, hang on, that's not ADHD. So it's
Totally. And that's kind of what so I think it's also being a health professional myself and already knowing exactly what I was going to get asked on the assessment. I knew which questions were for ADHD and which ones were for autism. And because I knew I had ADHD, every time they asked me one of the autism questions, I'd say, oh, no, I don't do that. And upon reflection, maybe I do that, but the way that the questions are asked are not always designed for what I would call girl autism. So,
Yep.
they say, oh, do you have trouble making friendships or do you have trouble socializing? No, I've always been very social and I have a lot of friends. That's never been an issue for me. Do I overanalyze every single social interaction to the nth degree and then rehearse the next one in my head? Yes, but that wasn't one of the questions that they asked on the criteria. They just said, do you have trouble with it? And the answer is no, I've got heaps of friends and I socialize all the time. Am I completely burnt out afterwards? Yes, but that wasn't one of the questions on the thing. So now that I dig a little bit deeper, I'm like, I think you can get through the surface level of those questions and say, no, I don't have any troubles with that. But when you dig a little bit deeper and get to know your brain a little bit better, you're like, oh, maybe I do have some differences around that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but that's the literal thinking. Like, you would think they would write these questions more like to the point, not just like a broad, oh, do you have social problems?
Oh, yeah. Neurotypical people definitely wrote the questions. And so we're like, no, because it's not an exact yes to that question. I'm going to say no.
Yeah. And it's the same with NDIS, for example. That was totally written by neurotypical people.
Yeah.
So it is, that can be frustrating too. And I feel like that's why having neurodivergent people within fields that have a lot to do with other neurodivergent individuals is so important. Like, it makes sense to have a neurodivergent psychologist working with neurodivergent children or adults, because
absolutely
there is that life experience and that lived experience and that relatability, and it helps to build rapport. I find that like people are more open with me and more willing to come and talk to me because they know I'm neurodivergent too. So it's like, she's going to get it. And it's not going to be awkward. Like, someone's not going to sit there and go, what? So,
yeah, and I think that's why, like, in my private practice, I've tended to become more specializing, I guess, in neurodivergent kids, which was never the original intention, but you kind of gravitate towards those families. And also when you're trying to give parents advice, you can say, look, I tried this with my child, definitely didn't work, so I'm not going to judge you if it doesn't work for you guys. But you can sort of like keep having these ideas, and it feels very non-judgmental because they know that you're in the same boat and that you're trying to figure stuff out as well, rather than feeling like they're going to a professional who's just telling them to do all these things and they're feeling like a constant failure because those things aren't working in their home. So I feel like we're kind of more on the same team of going, this worked, this didn't work, you try it at home and see what works for you and we'll figure it out, somewhere in between.
I love that, because often, I don't know about you, but I often feel like when you're going to just those generic kind of professionals, you feel like you're just a number and they're not quite getting it. And they kind of go, oh, we can try this, we can try this, but if neither of these work, I don't know what to do. Like, there's nothing else. Like, there's always something else.
Yes.
But it's finding that person that's going to think outside the box. And every single profession to do with neurodivergence is problem solving, thinking outside of the box, trying something that may not sound conventional but it may literally just be that one thing that works. So I know for my son, I'm always thinking weird things like, let's just try it. It's not going to hurt anyone, and you never know.
Yeah, that's it. It cannot hurt, and let's just give it a go. And if you don't like it, we don't have to do it again. But if you do like it, it could be a really nice hack to get us through the morning or whatever.
Yeah, you pick your battles with this stuff.
Yeah, we've got the visual schedules, we've got timers, we've got sensory friendly clothing, we've got everything you can think of that just helps us get through the morning.
And like you were saying with all those wait lists too, like I think when my son was diagnosed, he was diagnosed 2015, so quite a while ago. But even back then, the wait lists were extensively long, and we ended up going through private, which not everyone can because it's expensive.
It is.
And I think that only took maybe 6 months before we had a diagnosis. But even now, private, you're still waiting 2 years, so it doesn't matter what you do.
That's right.
It's everyone's so desperate, and that's the thing, is so many people have gone under the radar, and I just have this feeling, I have this theory that COVID has really helped to push people to have assessments done. Like, we were all trapped with each other, and so we started to realise,
like, oh wow, you're quite interesting to live with.
Yeah, like, you think about it, we like send our kids to school and stuff, we don't see them for that period of the day and things like that.
Yeah.
People go to work, but when you start working from home together, it's like, wow, you're weird. Like,
Yeah.
you start judging each other.
Okay. You see all their little patterns that they do every day.
Yeah, the little routine rituals. So I feel like COVID kind of, like, obviously mental health declined for quite a lot of people when COVID hit. But I just feel like everyone being trapped together has kind of opened everyone's eyes to, okay, neurodivergence is a real thing. Like, so many people for so long was like, is that real though? Or is that just like a cop out to make an excuse because you can't do something? But it is real.
And it's so funny, like, I will admit, like, when I was a young therapist, just about every kid that would come in on my caseload would have ADHD written next to their other diagnosis, which would be like language disorder, autism, whatever it was. And I'd be like, oh, I feel like they just hand this out like they hand out candy. And because I just didn't have a really good understanding of what it was. And I think it was very much thought of as like a little boy's disease at that time. And so I guess I was guilty of that as well until I really dug deeper and went, oh, actually, this is something that is really present in a lot of people, and most of them don't know it. And it's only due to, I guess, we're in this information age where, so for me, things like even TikToks of people just speaking to the camera and saying, this is my day and this is what it is to have ADHD, and you're like, oh, okay, that's definitely me. But before we had this non-traditional media, the only thing we knew about ADHD was that it was little boys that couldn't sit still in class, you know? So we had never heard an adult middle-aged woman talking about how ADHD presents for us. And until you hear that, you don't really identify with it. You go, oh, well, I'm not. So for me, like, my hyperactivity, it's in my brain, it's not in my body. And so I don't relate to the bouncing and the, you know, not being able to sit still. I'm quite happy to sit down. So until you really see yourself represented, which I think is probably the coolest thing that's happened to the neurodivergent community in the last, I don't know, 5 or so years, is everyone coming out of the woodwork and saying, all the stuff that you guys are doing in therapy doesn't work for us. All the way that you write the questions on your assessment doesn't work for us. This is how our brains actually work. This is how we actually think. And actually, we're pretty good at advocating for ourselves and describing what we need now that we actually have a voice to do that through social media, but we just never have any time in history before. And so that's why everything that was written about neurodivergent people was not actually from neurodivergent people.
Yeah, I was reading something just yesterday. It was a psychologist that's neurodivergent, and she started to I think she's in the UK, but she started to rewrite the questions for ADHD, especially for women. And she was writing things like, instead of writing, do you struggle with being late, for example, she would say, do you struggle with being late in a way where you are really late or you are super early, so you make sure you're not late. And it's like, that's a good qualifier, because I'm usually not late because I make sure I'm really early. So, you know.
Yes, and like another example of that I heard was saying, like, would you struggle with being late if you didn't have a lot of strategies in place? And that's probably more me. Like, naturally, I am late to absolutely everything. But if I have something to be on time from, I can, but I've put like 100 checklists in place to get there on time, because it does not come naturally for me. I've got terrible time blindness and get easily distracted by something and not sure how long things will take, especially, you know, when you become a parent, you've got to get everybody else ready too. So I guess if you just said, are you always late? The answer might be no, I'm not always late. But is every single day an absolute struggle to get somewhere on time? Yes, it is. So it's all about that phrasing and understanding, well, no, because I'm masking. So the answer to that is no, I don't do that, because I'm really good at figuring out how to not do it.
I mean, you weren't late today. You were on time.
I was so impressed with myself.
You were on time. Same with me for my ADHD. It's in my brain. The only time I'm never hyperactive. Like, I'm not running around or anything like that. But the only time I can't sit still is my anxiety, which is, you know, it can be a part of it. But it'd be like I keep standing up and not wanting to sit and things like that. I won't be like running on the spot or anything, but I just can't relax as such. So whereas my son runs around like crazy, and for me, that looks like to me like it's in his brain, but he's trying to get his body to keep up with his brain, so he just runs around like a maniac. And but you get a lot of, oh no, he's just a boy. Boys do that, you know. There's that kind of side of things too, and it's like girls don't have that because they just don't do that. And it's and as you say, it should be different questions for girls versus boys. And it's the same with autism. For the longest time, they were like, only boys have autism. But now it's 1 in 4 women are autistic. Like 1 in 4 autistic people are women.
Women. And I actually would challenge that statistic and say, I think it's even more than that, but we just don't get picked up. And I think it's interesting for me. It's been a real like point of reflection for me, is that I have a boy and a girl, and I believe they're both neurodivergent. But the boy I knew like that at 9 months. The girl, it took me until like 4.5 or almost 5 to figure it out. She won't wear clothes. She's extremely sensory avoidant. She hates getting her hair brushed. We cut it into a bob so that she doesn't need to get it brushed. She has exactly one pair of shoes that she will wear without socks. And so all of this stuff, but it was constantly described as, isn't she stubborn? Isn't she? So she bosses the play. So when she plays, she'll script it out for her friends and say, okay, pretend that your doll says this, and then I'll pretend my doll says this. And so that's described as bossy or stubborn. And that's the words we put around girls. And so until I said, actually, I think she might be neurodivergent, she just does not at all look like my son, who looks like a textbook case. It took a little while, even for me, who's someone who does this for a living and is myself neurodivergent, to go, hey, we actually just label girls with really negative stereotypes instead of saying, I think they're neurodivergent and that's why they're doing stuff like that. And so since having that realization that she's neurodivergent, it's just been such a game changer, because you're so much more compassionate. You know, the reason she's not getting dressed isn't because she's naughty. It's because those clothes feel like pins and needles to her and she doesn't want to put them on. And, you know, the reason that she's like having an emotional reaction isn't because she's naughty. It's because she's having trouble regulating her emotions. And so once you can recognize that your child is neurodivergent, the level of compassion that you can have for them is just so much greater, because you're not seeing them as naughty or defiant anymore.
You literally could have described me as a child to a T. My mind is just being blown as you're describing your daughter, because I was exactly the same. My mum used to get so frustrated taking me shoe shopping, because we would go to 60 different stores and try on 600 different pairs of shoes, and we would still leave empty-handed. And I still remember a trip
just
to
weren't
Sydney.
Quite right.
Yeah, and I remember a trip to Sydney, and my shoes were falling off my feet because I would just wear them and wear them and wear them. And we went into Big W, and there was a pair of the shoes I was wearing on clearance in my size, and it was like the happiest moment of my life.
Those exact ones. That's the ones I want.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I was like, on clearance, bonus. But just things like that, it comes back. You remember those things. And I was the same with my hair being brushed. I hated it. I hated my nails being cut. I used to scream the house
she
down.
still won't let me. Yeah.
Like I thought I was being murdered. Same with eating. I had sensory issues, and I still have sensory issues with food. And I just remember being forced to eat these foods that made me want to throw up, and then getting punished because I threw up, like getting told I was a hypochondriac.
My absolute first sign of neurodivergence is that I was an extremely fussy eater, and it was such just a sticking point. And I think culturally in my family, food was just such a big thing, and I just wanted to have plain Vegemite sandwiches every day. And it was every time I dread going to like family dinners and stuff, because I knew the comments were going to come. When I was like, I'm just happy eating this. Just let me eat this. Please don't push something else onto me. And it was very much seen as me being difficult or naughty. And I am an absolute people pleaser. So the last thing that I wanted to be was naughty or inconvenient. But I literally just wanted to eat this Vegemite sandwich or these plain hot chips and just please leave me alone.
I was exactly the same. And I still am. Even growing up, I would tend to want to eat by myself, hide away, and because I was scared of the judgment. And so even at school, I wouldn't want to eat around other people because I was scared they would make comments on what was in my lunchbox. Or even when I was working, I would have my lunch break and try to hide somewhere where I knew people weren't going to approach me while I was eating or want to eat with me and things like that. And it is the anxiety behind that is real, and it is a fear. And so when my son started showing those signs, I did not push those things upon him. It was just like, okay, in your own time. He's broadening his horizons now. He's trying new things, but it's in his own time. And I just remember so much trauma from being forced to do those kinds of things. And it wasn't my parents' fault. They didn't know.
No, we didn't even have a name for it back then. Like, it wasn't even on the radar that this could be a symptom.
Yeah, so I don't begrudge. They thought they were doing the right thing. They were doing the things that they were told was normal parenting, but I wasn't a neurotypical child, so it wasn't going to work. But they didn't know that.
In many ways, I think like our kids are so blessed to have neurodivergent parents that go, yeah, I also think peas are revolting and I'm never going to make you eat them. Like, so, and not force them, because that was the most awful feeling of just sitting there and being forced to eat a food that will physically make you sick and being told that you're naughty if you won't eat it. And so now I'm just like, when I make dinner for my kids, they all have like a healthy dinner, but it's completely different. My daughter only likes crunchy food, so she'll have like raw carrot, raw snow peas, loves the crunch, whereas my son's quite happy to have steamed broccoli and mashed potato. But they don't have the same foods, and that's fine. I'm quite happy to make it as long as they're eating healthy foods that they like.
Well, I find like none of my siblings were diagnosed or have been diagnosed except me, as far as I'm aware. I'm the eldest of 9 children, and I know at least half of them are neurodivergent, but I would say the more I'm learning, they're probably all neurodivergent. But that's one thing that sticks in my mind is my mum was constantly complaining, I'm like a short order cook. I have to make a different meal for every single child. I'm like, red flag.
Mm-hmm. What's this telling you?
Yeah, so it's really interesting what we learn about ourselves and how that can help our children in the future. And the traumas we've been through, we can kind of break that cycle of they don't have to be subjected to that now, because we went through it, we know what it's like, it's awful, and we've identified it and we know how to avoid it.
Yes, yeah. And that said, I always say this to the parents that I'm working with in my clinic, parenting someone who has a different brain to you requires infinite patience. You have to be so patient as you try on the 14th top for the day to see which one feels nice. You have to be so patient when you cook dinner and it was actually a different brand of chicken nuggets this time and they don't like those ones. You have to constantly be patient. And sometimes what you want to do is scream and say, this is so annoying. But being able to hold on to that and create that space for your child and say, yeah, okay, I understand that t-shirt feels really icky and I'm not going to make you wear it. That is so important, and it's going to mean so much to those kids when they're older, because they get to figure out at 5 what we figured out at 35. And I think that makes me feel like it's all worthwhile.
And you're right with patience as well. And patience can be really hard when you're neurodivergent anyway. So when you're neurodivergent, right. You're a neurodivergent parent.
I'm overstimulated. You're overstimulating me.
And they're like, it's all about co-regulation. You're like, is that
We're both dysregulated?
Is that possible? So you're right. Like that, the patient side of thing is so important. And I never thought in a million years I would ever be this patient, but you're always beating yourself up and thinking, I could be more patient than this. But it's also your own neurodivergence. You've got like that ADHD side of things. It's like wanting things now, impulsivity. I want it now, just get it done. But then, having to wait, as you say, getting through the 16th t-shirt and it's still not right. And you're starting to, dysregulate by that point. But that brings me to my final question, which is, why do you think your profession is so important?
I think that's a great question. And I think it's something that I have reflected on a lot, because even in my own practice as a professional, the way I used to do things is not the way I do things now. So I think my profession is important because it used to be that, we support people to learn how to talk or to communicate, but I actually don't think that anymore. I think the reason my profession is important is because we create space for people to participate in whatever way that they need to participate. And I think that is the key change. So when I very first started working as a speech pathologist, we used to use a lot of therapies with autistic kids that were very much about making them not look autistic anymore. So don't stim, make eye contact. Here's some scripted phrasing you can use when someone asks how your day is. That was very much the speech therapy that was going on 10, 15 years ago. And through my own experience of having neurodivergent kids, of being neurodivergent myself and keeping up with the latest research, I've really turned everything I've ever learned about being a speech therapist on its head, and now saying, okay, well, our job is to teach people. It's almost like I have this new podcast coming out that's called Welcome to Neurotypical World, and it's for neurodiverse kids. It's almost like a Lonely Planet traveler's guide. Like, you've landed on this planet and the neurotypicals act like this, and this is what you need to know in order to survive in this world. You don't need to change who you are, but just so you know, the neurotypicals will want to look at you in the eye. And just so you know, the neurotypicals will want you to say good when they say, how are you? Even if you're not good, you just say good. And, so really helping neurodiverse kids. And we do a lot of what used to be called like social skills programs. We now just call them holiday programs, which is just a safe space for neurodivergent kids to come during the school holidays to make friends with other neurodiverse kids. Which they love, because there's often we communicate better with each other, and to go, this is the world you're living in. Sometimes it's really hard to navigate relationships and friendships. Sometimes it's really hard to navigate schedules. Sometimes it's really hard to navigate apologies and negotiations, and teaching them strategies to get through that, rather than the old school way of therapy, which was, don't do that, just act normal. And so I think that's how things have changed and are changing in our profession, and that's where I'd really like to see them go, is to just go with people's authenticity, go with their strengths, but also, teaching them how to survive in the world that's not really built for them.
I love that, because, as you say, there's a lot of masking involved, and when it's almost like a lot of people were teaching neurodivergence, like kind of shaming them into masking, like, you can't do that, or as you were saying, you shouldn't stim, that's weird. But I love that it's, you're kind of creating a manual for, like, as if we're on an alien planet and we don't speak their language. So that's really, really cool. So I'll keep an eye out for that. But your current podcast is the Talking Children's podcast, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So the Talking Children podcast is a podcast for parents and also like early childhood professionals, just kind of breaking down the latest research in child communication development and how we can apply that in our everyday lives. And we have a real passion, especially for episodes on working with neurodiverse kids, because I think there's a lot of new research coming out and a lot of people looking for advice for how to support kids' communication in that space.
That's really cool. And is it available on Spotify? How can people find it?
Yeah, so it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify. If you just type Talking Children podcast into any of those engines, then you'll find it. We're also on Facebook and Instagram as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go and add that to my list of podcasts to listen to. It sounds really, really interesting. So I want to thank you for your time, and it's really been really awesome talking to you. It sounds like we're practically soul sisters. So
it's been great talking to you too.
I just love it. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll get to chat again.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. Take care. Bye.